a WikiVidi Documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Australian rules football. Australian rules football, officially known as Australian football, or simply called Aussie rules football or footy, is a contact sport played between two teams of 18 players on an oval-shaped field, often a modified cricket ground. Points are scored by kicking the oval-shaped ball between the goal posts or behind posts. If scores are level at the end of certain matches, such as the grand final or other finals matches, either extra time or a rematch is required the following week to determine the winner. During general play, players may position themselves anywhere on the field and use any part of their bodies to move the ball. The primary methods are kicking, handballing and running with the ball. There are rules on how the ball can be handled. For example, players running with the ball must intermittently bounce or touch it on the ground. Throwing the ball is not allowed and players must not get caught holding the ball. A distinctive feature of the game is the mark, where players anywhere on the field who catch the ball from a kick are awarded possession. Possession of the ball is in dispute at all times except when a free kick or mark is paid. Players can tackle using their hands or use their whole body to obstruct opponents. Dangerous physical contact. Interference when marking and deliberately slowing the play are discouraged with free kicks, distance penalties or suspension for a certain number of matches, depending on the seriousness of the infringement. The game features frequent physical contests, spectacular marking, fast movement of both players and the ball and high scoring. The sport's origins can be traced to football matches played in Melbourne, Victoria in 1858. Inspired by English public school football games. Seeking to develop a game more suited to adults and Australian conditions, the Melbourne Football Club published the first laws of Australian football in May 1859, making it the oldest of the world's major football codes. Australian football has the highest spectator attendance and television viewership of all sports in Australia, while the Australian Football League, the sport's only fully professional competition, is the nation's wealthiest sporting body. The AFL Grand Final, held annually at the Melbourne Cricket Ground, is the highest attended club championship event in the world. The sport is also played at amateur level in many countries and in several variations. Its rules are governed by the AFL Commission with the advice of the AFL's Laws of the Game Committee. Origins. There is evidence of football being played sporadically in the Australian colonies in the first half of the 19th century. Compared to cricket and horse racing, football was viewed as a minor amusement at the time. And while little is known about these early one-off games, it is clear they share no causal link with Australian football. In 1858, in a move that would help to shape Australian football in its formative years, public schools in Melbourne, Victoria began organising football games inspired by precedents at English public schools. The earliest such match, held in St Kilda on the 15th of June, was between Melbourne Grammar and St Kilda Grammar. On the 10th of July 1858, the Melbourne-based Bell's Life in Victoria and Sporting Chronicle published a letter by Tom Wills, captain of the Victoria cricket team, calling for the formation of a football club with a code of laws to keep cricketers fit during winter. Born in Australia, Wills played a nascent form of rugby football whilst a pupil at rugby school in England, and returned to his homeland a star athlete and cricketer. His letter is regarded by many historians as giving impetus for the development of a new code of football today known as Australian football. 2 weeks later, Will's friend, cricketer Jerry Bryant, posted an advertisement for a scratch match at the Richmond paddock adjoining the Melbourne Cricket Ground. This was the first of several kickabouts held that year involving members of the Melbourne Cricket Club, including Wills, Bryant, W. J. Hammersley and J. B. Thompson. Trees were used as goalposts and play typically lasted an entire afternoon. Without an agreed-upon code of laws, some players were guided by rules they had learned in the British Isles, others by no rules at all. Another significant milestone in 1858 was a match played under experimental rules between Melbourne Grammar and Scotch College, held at the Richmond paddock. This 40-a-side contest, umpired by Wills and Scotch college teacher Don McAdam, began on the 7th of August and continued over 2 subsequent Saturdays, ending in a draw with each side kicking 1 goal. It is commemorated with a statue outside the McGee. And the 2 schools have competed annually ever since in the Cordner-Eggleston Cup, the world's oldest continuous football competition, since the early 20th century. It has been suggested that Australian football was derived from the Irish sport of Gaelic football, which was not codified until 1885. There is no archival evidence in favour of a Gaelic influence, and the style of play shared between the 2 modern codes was evident in Australia long before the Irish game evolved in a similar direction. Another theory, first proposed in 1983, posits that Wills, having grown up amongst Aborigines in Victoria, may have seen or played the Aboriginal game of Marn Grook, and incorporated some of its features into early Australian football. The evidence for this is only circumstantial, and according to biographer Greg DeMoore's research, Wills was almost solely influenced by his experience at rugby school. First rules. A loosely organised Melbourne side, captained by Wills, played against other football enthusiasts in the winter and spring of 1858. The following year, on the 14th of May, the Melbourne Football Club officially came into being, making it one of the world's oldest football clubs. 3 days later, Wills, Hammersley, Thompson and teacher Thomas H. Smith met near the McGee at the Parade Hotel, owned by Bryant, and drafted 10 rules, the rules of the Melbourne Football Club. These are the laws from which Australian football evolved. The club's stated aim was to create a simple code that was suited to the hard playing surfaces around Melbourne, and to eliminate the roughest aspects of English school games, such as hacking, in rugby school football, to lessen the chance of injuries to working men. In another significant departure from English public school football, the Melbourne rules omitted any offside law. The new code was as much a reaction against the school games as influenced by them, writes Mark Pennings. The rules were distributed throughout the colony. Thompson in particular did much to promote the new code in his capacity as a journalist. Australian football's date of codification predates that of any other major football code, including soccer and rugby union. Early competition in Victoria. Following Melbourne's lead, Geelong and Melbourne University also formed football clubs in 1859. While many early Victorian teams participated in one-off matches, most had not yet formed clubs for regular competition. A South Yarra side devised its own rules. To ensure the supremacy of the Melbourne rules, the first club-level competition in Australia, the Caledonian Society's Challenge Cup, stipulated that only the Melbourne rules were to be used. This law was reinforced by the Athletic Sports Committee, which ran a variation of the Challenge Cup in 1865-66, with input from other clubs. The rules underwent several minor revisions, establishing a uniform code known as Victorian Rules. In 1866, the first distinctively Victorian rule, the running bounce, was formalised at a meeting of club delegates chaired by H.C.A. Harrison, an influential pioneer who took up football in 1859 at the invitation of Wills, his cousin. The game around this time was defensive and low-scoring, played low to the ground in congested rugby-style scrimmages. The typical match was a 20-per-side affair, played with a ball that was roughly spherical, and lasted until a team scored 2 goals. The shape of the playing field was not standardized. Matches often took place in rough, tree-spotted public parks, most notably the Richmond Paddock, known colloquially as the Melbourne Football Ground. Wills argued that the turf of cricket fields would benefit from being trampled upon by footballers in winter, and, as early as 1859, football was allowed on the McGee. However, cricket authorities frequently prohibited football on their grounds until the 1870s, when they saw an opportunity to capitalise on the sport's growing popularity. Football gradually adapted to an oval-shaped field, and most grounds in Victoria expanded to accommodate the dual purpose, a situation that continues to this day. Other colonies. Football became organised in South Australia in 1860 with the formation of the Adelaide Football Club, the oldest football club in Australia outside Victoria. It devised its own rules, and, along with other Adelaide-based clubs, played a variety of codes until 1876, when they agreed to uniformly adopt most of the Victorian rules, with South Australian football pioneer Charles Kingston noting their similarity to the old Adelaide rules. Likewise, Tasmanian clubs quarrelled over different rules until they adopted a slightly modified version of the Victorian game in 1879. The South Australian Football Association, the sport's first governing body, formed on the 30th of April 1877, firmly establishing Victorian rules as the preferred code in that colony. The Victorian Football Association formed the following month, as clubs began touring the colonies in the late 1870s. The sport spread to New South Wales, and in 1879, the first intercolonial match took place in Melbourne between Victoria and South Australia, in an attempt to standardise the sport across Australia. Delegates representing the football associations of South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria and Queensland met in 1883 and updated the code. New rules such as holding the ball led to a golden era of fast, long kicking and high-marking football in the 1880s, a time which also saw the rise of professionalism, particularly in Victoria and Western Australia, and players such as George Coulthard achieved superstardom. Now known as Australasian rules or Australian rules, it became the first football code to develop mass spectator appeal, attracting world record attendances for sports viewing, and gaining a reputation as the people's game. The sport reached Queensland as early as 1866, and experienced a period of dominance there. But, like in New Zealand and areas of New South Wales north of the Riverina, it struggled to thrive, largely due to the spread of rugby football with British migration, regional rivalries and the lack of strong local governing bodies. In the case of Sydney, denial of access to grounds. The influence of university headmasters from Britain who favoured rugby, and the loss of players to other codes inhibited the game's growth. Emergence of the Fell. In 1896, delegates from 6 of the wealthiest VFA clubs, Carlton, Essendon, Fitzroy, Geelong, Melbourne and South Melbourne, met to discuss the formation of a breakaway professional competition, later joined by Collingwood and St Kilda. The clubs formed the Victorian Football League, which held its inaugural season in 1897. The Fell's popularity grew rapidly as it made several innovations, such as instituting a finals system, reducing teams from 20 to 18 players, and introducing the behind as a score. Richmond and University joined the Fell in 1908, and by 1925, with the addition of Hawthorn, Footscray, and North Melbourne, it had become the preeminent league in the country and would take a leading role in many aspects of the sport. Effects of the two world wars. Both World War I and World War II had a devastating effect on Australian football and on Australian sport in general. While scratch matches were played by Australian diggers in remote locations around the world, the game lost many of its great players to wartime service. Some clubs and competitions never fully recovered. Between 1914 and 1915, a proposed hybrid code of Australian football and rugby league, the predominant code of football in New South Wales and Queensland, was trialled without success. World War I saw the game in New Zealand go into recess for 3/4 of a century. In Queensland, the State League went into recess for the duration of the war. Fell Club University left the league and went into recess due to severe casualties. The WAFL lost 2 clubs, and the SANFL was suspended for 1 year in 1916 due to heavy club losses. The Anzac Day clash is one example of how the war continues to be remembered in the football community. Interstate football and the ANFC. The role of the Australian National Football Council was primarily to govern the game at a national level and to facilitate interstate representative and club competition. The ANFC ran the Championship of Australia, The first national club competition, which commenced in 1888 and saw clubs from different states compete on an even playing field, although clubs from other states were at times invited. The final was almost always between the premiers from the two strongest state competitions of the time, South Australia and Victoria, and the majority of matches were played in Adelaide at the request of the SAFA/SIFL. The last match was played in 1976, with North Adelaide being the last non-Victorian winner in 1972. Between 1976 and 1987, the ANFC, and later the Australian Football Championships ran a night series, which invited clubs and representative sides from around the country to participate in a knockout tournament parallel to the Premiership seasons, which Victorian sides still dominated. With the lack of international competition, state representative matches were regarded with great importance. The Australian Football Council coordinated regular interstate carnivals, including the Australasian Football Jubilee, held in Melbourne in 1908 to celebrate the game's semi-centenary. Due in part to the fell poaching talent from other states, Victoria dominated interstate matches for three-quarters of a century. State of origin rules, introduced in 1977, stipulated that rather than representing the state of their adopted club, players would return to play for the state they were first recruited in. This instantly broke Victoria's stranglehold over state titles, and Western Australia and South Australia began to win more of their games against Victoria. Both New South Wales and Tasmania scored surprise victories at home against Victoria in 1990. Towards a national competition. The term, Barassi line, named after fell star Ron Barassi, was coined by scholar Ian Turner in 1978 to describe the fictitious geographical barrier separating large parts of New South Wales and Queensland, which predominantly followed the two rugby codes from the rest of the country, where Australian football reigned. It became a reference point for the expansion of Australian football and for establishing a national league. The way the game was played had changed dramatically due to innovative coaching tactics, with the phasing out of many of the game's kicking stars and the increasing use of handball. While presentation was influenced by television, in 1982, in a move that heralded big changes within the sport, one of the original fell clubs, South Melbourne, relocated to Sydney and became known as the Sydney Swans. In the late 1980s, due to the poor financial standing of many of the Victorian clubs, and a similar situation existing in Western Australia in the sport, the fell pursued a more national competition. Two more non-Victorian clubs, West Coast and Brisbane, joined the league in 1987. In their early years, the Sydney and Brisbane clubs struggled both on and off-field because the substantial TV revenues they generated by playing on a Sunday went to the fell. To protect these revenues, the fell granted significant draft concessions and financial aid to keep the expansion clubs competitive. Each club was required to pay a licence fee which allowed the Victorian-based clubs to survive. The fell changed its name to the Australian Football League for the 1990 season, and over the next decade, three non-Victorian clubs gained entry: Adelaide, Fremantle and the SANFL's Port Adelaide, the only pre-existing club outside Victoria to join the league, in 2011 and 2012 respectively. Two new non-Victorian clubs were added to the competition, Gold Coast and Greater Western Sydney. The AFL, currently with 18 member clubs, is the sport's elite competition and most powerful body. Following the emergence of the AFL, state leagues were quickly relegated to a second-tier status. The VFA merged with the former Fell Reserves competition in 1998, adopting the Fell name. State of origin also declined in importance, especially after an increasing number of player withdrawals. The AFL turned its focus to the annual International Rules Series against Ireland in 1998 before abolishing state of origin the following year. State and territorial leagues still contest interstate matches, as do AFL women players. Although a Tasmanian AFL bid is ongoing, the AFL's focus has been on expanding into markets outside Australian football's traditional heartlands. The AFL regularly schedules pre-season exhibition matches in all Australian states and territories as part of the Regional Challenge. The AFL signalled further attempts at expansion in the 2010s by hosting home and away matches in New Zealand, followed by China. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?